My name is Mara Dellen. I'm 29 years old. And the Sunday dinner where my sister told a table of 9 people that I had quit a real job to sell muffins was the night I understood that the gap between what you are building and what the people around you can see is not a problem you can argue your way across. She did not build toward it. That was the thing about my sister Joss. She did not frame things as attacks, which made them harder to respond to, because they didn't arrive as attacks. They arrived as announcements, delivered in the register of someone sharing a piece of information the room had somehow missed. She set her fork down, looked at the center of the table rather than at me, and said it to the room. She quit her real job to sell muffins. Someone tell her that's not a career. My father laughed, a short, reflexive sound, the kind that escapes before a person decides whether to let it. My mother looked at the serving dish in front of her. My brother Cam said, "We love you, but come on," which was the version of the same sentiment delivered with a softening clause that did not actually soften it. My grandmother at the far end of the table was watching me. My Aunt Bet, who was visiting from out of state, made a very small adjustment to her napkin. I picked up the water pitcher. I refilled my glass. I set the pitcher back down. I asked my grandmother if she wanted more, and she said yes, and I leaned across and filled hers too, and that was what I did with the next 20 seconds. Then I asked Cam about the renovation he'd mentioned last month, and he told me about the subfloor problem, and the table moved on. I drove home 40 minutes later with the windows down even though the evening was cool, because I needed the air and the noise and the particular sensation of moving away from something at a reasonable speed. What none of them knew, what I had not mentioned at that table or any other, was that 9 days earlier I had taken a call from a regional acquisitions manager at a national bakery and cafe chain called Heron and Mill, who had been referred to me by a wholesale grocery buyer named Patricia Sohn, and who had said, before we had been on the phone for 4 minutes, that she wanted to meet in person to discuss what a partnership might look like. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning is where the muffin comment actually came from, and the beginning explains everything. I had worked for 6 years as a purchasing coordinator at a regional food distribution company called Caldwell Provisions. I was good at the job. I understood supply chains, vendor relationships, the logic of moving product from a producer to a shelf in a way that accounted for timing, temperature, breakage, and margin. I knew what a SKU was and why it mattered, and how to read a cost per unit analysis without needing it explained. I had been promoted twice, once at 3 years, once at 5, and my manager, a precise and demanding man named Howard Finch, had told me at my last review that I was tracking toward a senior coordinator role within 18 months. I had also been baking since I was 11 years old. Not casually. Not as a hobby in the way that hobbies are things you do to fill the space that work leaves. I had baked with the same seriousness that I had brought to everything I cared about, studying the chemistry of it, understanding what gluten development meant and what it didn't, learning why humidity affected a croissant differently than a scone, why a brioche that proofed too fast was structurally compromised even if it looked correct. My mother had a stand mixer, and I had used it until the motor died when I was 15, and then I had saved money from a part-time job and bought my own. I started selling during the Caldwell years because a coworker named Dina Walsh asked me to make a cake for her daughter's birthday and mentioned it to 3 other people, and those 3 people asked, and I said yes, and then yes again, and by the second year at Caldwell, I was making approximately $600 a month in weekend orders, which was not nothing, and was not yet something. What changed was the sourdough. I had been working on a specific loaf, a high-hydration whole wheat sourdough with a particular crust behavior I had been chasing for 8 months, and when I finally got it right, in a January on a Saturday morning at 5:15, I brought a loaf to a neighborhood coffee shop called Vessel to see if the owner would be interested in carrying it. The owner, a woman named Tessa Lardo, tasted it at the counter, put it down, looked at me, and said, "How many can you produce per week right now with your current setup?" I said 12, conservatively. She said, "I'll take 10. Come back next Saturday." I came back the following Saturday with 10 loaves. They sold out by noon. Tess called me that afternoon and asked if I could do 15 the week after. I said yes. That was the thread I pulled. Within 4 months, I was supplying Vessel with 20 loaves of sourdough per week and had added 2 additional products, a seeded rye and a white Pullman, at Tess's request, because her customers had started asking what else I made. I was also taking weekend pastry orders and filling a small weekly pre-order list that had formed through a neighborhood email list without my planning for it. I was also exhausted in a way that had a clear cause. I was working a full-time job and running a production operation in a residential kitchen, and the two things had different rhythms that did not align and were beginning to wear on each other in ways I could measure. The sourdough required a specific fermentation window that was not compatible with a 9 to 6 schedule and a 40-minute commute. I was waking at 3:30 to get the timing right. The Sunday I had been at Caldwell Provisions long enough and clear-eyed enough about what the numbers were doing to make the decision with something better than hope. I gave notice on a Thursday. Howard Finch received it professionally and asked if I had considered the timing. I said I had. He said he was sorry to lose me and that the door was open. I said I appreciated that and meant it. I did not tell my family before I gave notice. I told them the following Sunday at dinner, which is the dinner where Joss made the announcement. The reason I had not told them before was not avoidance. It was that I had been running numbers for 3 months, and I understood what I was stepping into, and I also understood that my family's relationship to the numbers would be different from mine, and I wanted to make the decision from my own assessment rather than from a negotiation with their concerns. That was not a slight to them. It was a structural choice about where to put the weight of the decision. What I did not anticipate was that Joss would receive the news as a public occasion rather than a private one. She had a quality, genuine, not strategic, of treating family dinner as a stage for the processing of information, a place where things got sorted out in front of witnesses, and she believed, I think, that this was a form of engagement rather than performance. She was not trying to humiliate me. She was trying to have a conversation she thought needed having, and she had simply misjudged the scale of what she was saying and the room it would make. That is the honest account of it. I registered the business as Dellin Bread and Pastry in February of the year I left Caldwell. I operated out of a licensed commercial kitchen space, a shared facility called the Foundry Kitchen, managed by a coordinator named Suki Brandt, that rented by the hour to small food producers and catering operations. The Foundry was 12 minutes from my apartment and had the oven capacity and the health department certification that a residential kitchen could not provide at scale. I worked 12 to 14 hours a day for the first 4 months. The production window at the Foundry ran from 4 in the morning to early afternoon, which suited the fermentation schedule, and left the afternoons for delivery, ordering, and the administrative layer that multiplied faster than I had projected. I hired my first assistant, a culinary school graduate named Felix Oma, who had been doing prep work at a hotel restaurant and was looking for something with more variety. In month 3, Felix was fast and precise and learned the sourdough process in 2 weeks, which was half the time I had expected it to take. By month 5, I had accounts at 4 coffee shops, 2 specialty grocery stores, and a weekly farmer's market that had become, somewhat unexpectedly, the highest visibility thing I did, not in revenue terms but in the sense of who saw the product and talked about it. The farmer's market customers were vocal. They brought friends. They tagged the table on social media in the way that people do when they find something they feel they discovered rather than were sold. The specialty grocery accounts had come through a buyer named Patricia Sohn at a regional grocery group called Meadow Market, who had approached the farmer's market table on a Saturday in April and asked whether I was interested in wholesale supply. I said I was interested in having the conversation, which I had learned, partly from 6 years at Caldwell, partly from watching Tess Alardo run a counter, was different from saying yes. Patricia and I had 3 conversations over 6 weeks. She asked about my production capacity, my consistency controls, my shelf life data, my packaging. She was systematic and unimpressed by enthusiasm, which I found useful because it required me to answer in specifics rather than in projections. We agreed on an initial 4-SKU trial across 3 Meadow Market locations. The terms were standard for a small producer entering retail, lower margins than I wanted, net 30 payment, no exclusivity. I signed the agreement with Patricia's commercial terms reviewed by a food business attorney named Lila Prescott, who charged me $475 for 2 hours of her time and identified one clause in the indemnification language that I would have missed. I paid the $475 without hesitation. The Meadow Market trial ran for 8 weeks. Sell-through on the sourdough was 94% in week 1, 97% in weeks 2 and 3. Meadow Market expanded to all 11 locations at the end of week 8. Patricia called to tell me herself rather than emailing, which I noted. Year 1 revenue for Dellen Bread and Pastry, $214,000, the majority of it weighted toward the back half of the year after the Meadow Market expansion. Felix and I were the entire production team. I was paying myself $52,000 annually, which was less than I had made at Caldwell and more than the business could have supported in the first 2 quarters. The call from Heron and Mill came on a Wednesday afternoon in the 9th month of operation. The acquisitions manager's name was Diane Voss. She had found me through Patricia Sohn, who had apparently mentioned Dellen Bread and Pastry in a conversation about regional producers worth watching. Diane was straightforward and quick. She said Heron and Mill was in an expansion phase and was specifically looking for established small-batch bakery brands with demonstrated retail performance and production scalability. She said she had looked at our Meadow Market numbers, which Patricia had shared with her permission, and she wanted to meet. I said I was available the following week. We met at the Heron and Mill regional office, a building I had driven past for years without knowing what was inside, on a Thursday morning. Diane brought a colleague, a product development director named Ron Caswell, who asked most of the technical questions. I brought the production data and the Meadow Market sell-through report and a 1-page summary of our cost structure that I had put together with help from a business advisor named Kwame Asani, who I had started working with in month 4 when it became clear the administrative layer was growing faster than I could manage alone. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes. Ron asked about the sourdough starter, its age, its hydration, whether it was proprietary. I said the starter was 9 years old, that I had been maintaining it since before the business existed, that the hydration and feeding schedule were documented, and that yes, I considered it proprietary in the sense that replicating its specific microbial profile in a new environment would take time and attention that could not be shortcut. He wrote something down. Diane asked about my interest level in a partnership versus an acquisition. I said I was interested in understanding what Heron and Mill meant by both before I had an opinion about either. She said that was a fair answer. We shook hands at the door. She said she'd be in touch within 2 weeks. She was in touch in 11 days. The offer that arrived, reviewed by Lila Prescott, who I called the same afternoon it came through, was a full acquisition of the Dellen Bread and Pastry brand, recipes, starter culture, and retail relationships at a valuation I will not state here because the number that went public was the number the press reported, and the number the press reported was the number that matters to this story. What I will say is that the body of the agreement, the earn-out provisions, the brand protection clauses, the production transition timeline took Lila and me 3 weeks to negotiate to a place where I was satisfied with it, and that Lila's total fee across that process was $3,800, which was the most useful $3,800 I had spent since the business started. I signed the acquisition agreement on a Tuesday morning. The press release went out the following Thursday. Heron and Mill's communications team distributed it through their standard channels, trade press, food industry publications, regional business press. I had not known, until Diane mentioned it on the Monday before the release, that a local television news segment had expressed interest in the story. Regional food producer acquired by national chain, small batch to national scale, 9-year-old sourdough starter as the centerpiece. The segment aired on the Thursday evening news broadcast. I watched it from my apartment. Felix watched it from his. Lila Prescott texted at 9:47 that evening. Congratulations. The clause held. Kwame Asani texted at 10:03, called it in month 4. You can remind me I said so. My phone did not stop moving for the next 40 minutes. Most of the messages were from the farmers market regulars, the Meadow Market team, Tessa Lardo, people from the Foundry Kitchen. Suki Brandt, the coordinator, sent a voice note that was mostly ambient noise and what sounded like applause from whatever room she was in. At 11:14, the family group chat, which had been running at its normal low idle of forwarded articles and birthday reminders, went quiet in the specific way that a chat goes quiet when everyone in it has received the same information at approximately the same time, and no one has decided what to say first. Joss called the following morning at 8:42. I was at the kitchen table with coffee, which had been my default location for thinking through things since the Caldwell years. I had been awake since 6. She said, I saw the news. I said, I figured. She said, Mara. Just my name. Then nothing for a moment. I waited. She said, I said something really unfair at dinner. I've been thinking about it since before this happened. I want you to know that. I said, I know. She said, I didn't understand what you were building. I thought I did, but I was looking at what I could see, which was you leaving a stable job, and she stopped. I was scared for you. I handled that by saying something unkind in front of people, and that was wrong. I sat with that for a moment. It was the most direct thing Joss had said to me in several years, and I wanted to receive it correctly, which meant not rushing past it. I said, I know you were scared. That part one understood. She said, the muffins thing was. I said, it was reductive. Yes. She said, I'm sorry. I said, I know you are. A pause. She said, can I ask you something? I said, yes. She said, when did you know it was going to work? I thought about that. About the Saturday morning in January at 5:15, when the loaf came out right. About Tessa Lardo putting it down on the counter and asking how many I could produce. About month 3, when I looked at the numbers and saw the shape of what they were becoming and felt something in my chest settle that had not been settled in a long time. I said, month 3, when the Meadow Market conversation started. I could see the structure of it. She said, I wish you'd told me. I said, I know. I wasn't ready to defend it yet. And I didn't want to spend energy defending it when I needed the energy to build it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that makes sense. I said, yeah. We talked for another 15 minutes about the acquisition and about the earnout timeline and about Felix, who was staying on through the production transition at a salary Heron and Mill had offered and that I had negotiated upward before I signed. She asked if I was staying involved with the brand. I said yes for 2 years on a consulting basis, which was part of the agreement and which I had wanted because I was not ready to hand the starter to someone I hadn't taught personally. We said goodbye. I refilled my coffee and sat with it. My father called that afternoon. He said he had watched the segment twice. He said he owed me an apology for laughing at the dinner and that he was saying it directly rather than letting it pass, because he thought letting it pass would be the easier thing, and he did not want to do the easier thing. I said I appreciated that. He asked if I was happy with the deal. I said yes, on balance, and that the balance was complicated because handing over something you built with your own hands is complicated even when the terms are right. He said he understood that. I thought he did. My brother Cam sent a text that said, the "but come on" was a bad call. I'm proud of you. I wrote back. The "we love you" part landed. Thank you. My mother called on a Sunday, which was when she called. She said she had not known what to say on the night it aired, which was why she hadn't called sooner. She said she had looked away at the dinner not because she agreed with Joss, but because she hadn't known how to stop it without making it worse, and that she had thought about that many times since. I said I knew, and that I didn't hold the looking away against her. She said she was glad, and that she had found the Vessel coffee shop and gone in and bought the last loaf on the shelf, and that it was the best bread she had eaten in years. I said, it took me 8 months to get that loaf right. She said, I believe it. Heron and Mill's expansion of the Dellen bread and pastry line launched in their Mid-Atlantic and Southeast locations 14 months after the acquisition. The sourdough was the anchor product. The seeded rye came with it. They added 2 products I developed during the transition year, a honey oat sandwich loaf and a multi-grain that used a slightly different fermentation approach I had been working toward for the better part of the previous year. Felix managed the production transition at the Heron and Mill facility with a team of 6. He had been promoted to production lead with a title and a salary that reflected what he was actually doing, which I had made a condition of finalizing the post-transition staffing plan. The Heron and Mill HR director, a woman named Vanessa Park, had raised one eyebrow at the specificity of my ask and then put it in writing, which was the correct response. Patricia Sohn attended the regional launch event. Tessa Lardo could not attend, but sent a note. Suki Brand attended and brought 2 people from the Foundry Kitchen who had been producing there when I was producing there, and who were, by that point, running their own operations at a scale that would have been hard to imagine from the shared production calendar we had all been managing 2 years earlier. I was present at the launch for 3 hours and then left, which was exactly as long as I needed to be there. I want to say something about the Sunday dinner, not because I have not said it already, but because I want to say the precise version. Joss said what she said because she was afraid of watching me fail, and the way she managed that fear was to name the failure before it could arrive and catch her off guard. That is not a generous interpretation, it is the accurate one, and the accurate one turns out to be more useful than the generous one because it doesn't require me to make her smaller than she is. She was not wrong that the risk was real. She was wrong that the risk was the whole story. That is a specific kind of error, the one where you see the load correctly and miss the structure that's carrying it. My father made the same error with a laugh. Cam made it with a softening clause. My mother made it by looking at the serving dish and letting it happen. None of them were trying to wound me. They were all reading the same incomplete information through the same lens, and the lens was love without visibility, which is a lens that distorts in a particular direction. The only thing I could do about that was what I did, which was to build until the structure was visible, and then let them look. That is the whole of the strategy, if it was a strategy. Build until there is something to see. Let the seeing happen on its own. Return to the table and ask if anyone wants more water. What you carry out of a moment like the one at that dinner table is not the wound, or not only the wound. You also carry the 40-minute drive home, with the windows down. The 5:15 Saturday morning, when the loaf came out right. The sound of Tess Alardo setting it on the counter and asking a practical question rather than a polite one. The things that kept you building are the story, not the things that tried to stop you. I know that now in a way I didn't on the drive home. The drive home I was just driving and the air was cool, and the city was doing what cities do at 10 o'clock on a Sunday, which is simply continuing. I was continuing too. That was enough. If you were at a table where someone announced, not to you but to the room, at a volume meant to be heard, that what you were building wasn't real. In the drive home afterward, the first time you stopped at a red light and the car was quiet, what did you think about? Not what you wished you'd said, what you actually thought about in the quiet. Because I think what came to you in that moment was closer to the truth of why you were building it than anything anyone said at the table. If this story found you today, share it with someone who is still explaining themselves to people who haven't seen the structure yet. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. I'll see you in the comments.